How's it going, everyone? My name is Bryce Newberger, and welcome to week 2 of Abuse and Addiction. This week, we're going to talk about partnering together in healing, and this is going to be part 1 of a 2-part little micro series. For this part, we're going to ask a lot of people today. So the first thing we might want to do is just start with a little bit of prayer. This week will be a sensitive week, and it might be picking at a few old wounds to people in the room. And so, go ahead and take some time among yourselves to pray. And just open us up with a good group discussion. I myself will join with you with just a little prayer right here. Thank you, God, for our conversation this week, Lord. I pray that you bless the conversation and the healing to happen, Lord. I pray that you open up our hearts from a point of grace and love and a drawing together. Thank you, Lord, for all these things. Now, guys, go ahead and have a prayer amongst yourselves. I'll wait. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to continue on with the first question. And so the first section we're actually going to talk about is couples should try to stay together. So if you are here and your marriage or your relationship has been struggling with addiction getting in the way of your relationship, you might have contemplated divorce or separation or leaving. And so what I'd like to say is that for the process of healing, it is better that two stay together. Now, if you look at, now I'm a divorced person, but if you look at the scriptures surrounding divorce and the situations around it, you're going to see that there are allowances for such a thing, but in all cases, God comes about and says, but it would be better for what God has united for man not to separate. And so the idea here is that there may be a need to separate here or there, but it's always going to be better if you stay together. There's something we want to avoid, which is known as enmeshment. Enmeshment in codependency is when someone loses their identity and personality to someone else. So enmeshment's a very bad thing. And the concern surrounding scriptures like the two join to become one flesh is that the couple will lose their individual identity within one another and become enmeshed. And so that's a clinical concern around some of the Christian teaching. And I do think that to a degree we can misinterpret that scripture to be pushing us towards enmeshment when really we are still individuals in Christ called to serve him first as a son or daughter of Christ and second as a husband or wife. What we want to talk about here is it is always going to be better for couples to strive to work together. The reason why is that addicts are used to making excuses for themselves, and they're very good at avoiding the hard work. And so to have a relationship end on them or to leave a relationship would actually be easier than to do the work of getting fixed themselves. And so it's always going to be better for the healing process for everyone involved. And as we talked about, or as we will talk about in the future, right? This is more into next week, but something in you chose that person. If you're not the addict in the relationship, and you'll just be doomed to do it again. That's why we see people married, 4 or 5 times in a row, and they keep thinking, I keep marrying the wrong person. Well, something in you keeps choosing the wrong person, and so that's known as co-addiction. We'll get into that here in the next next section that we have here. But for right now, we just want to emphasize couples should try and stay together. Now, how do you know if it's time to separate, or maybe even to get a divorce, or to stay together as one? Now, some people would say never get divorced. There's never an allowance for that. I'll be honest, I am against divorce. I didn't choose to get divorced. I would have gladly put things back together with my lovely little wife. However, that was not the case. So for you out there, if you might be thinking, what are you talking about, a time to get divorced? Well, let's call it separation, right? Drawing apart from one another to focus on healing. I think what's important to point out is that people who are codependent or perhaps enmeshed, they will stay together out of fear, they feel like they cannot live without the other person. Whereas those who are not codependent or enmeshed, they'll stay together out of strength in a commitment, as they made a vow before God, they made a vow before, their loved one, and they are committed to, 1 Corinthians style love. And so they're coming from a point of strength. And so if you feel that you are too weak to lose the other person, then you might be codependent or enmeshed, and that's a real telltale sign. Now, that's not saying immediately leave that person, but that's to say evaluate your relationship and ask yourself, are you staying together because you're enmeshed or codependent, or are you going to stay together out of strength? In all cases, it would be better to stay together out of strength, even if you are codependent or enmeshed. It would be to seek counseling from the church and find a way to stay together for strength. And your pastor or your counselor or your therapist can help guide you on whether that means a temporary separation so that you can break free of enmeshment, break free of codependency, and then decide to come together once again out of strength. We're going to take a second to pause each of these sections because this is challenging. If you're out there and you've been betrayed, you're thinking about leaving, this might be a time for people to share. Does anyone have anything to say about this section? Do you hate it? Do you love it? Do you agree with it? Do you think I'm completely wrong? Does this make anyone angry? And does anyone find this to be profound or life-altering? How or why? So we're going to open up this to group discussion. So we'll stop here for a second and we'll let everyone just have a little discussion before we come back together for our next section. Hopefully you guys have had a great discussion about trying to stay together, and hopefully you vented out some anger that might have caused among you. Hopefully some people haven't stormed out, but that can be very difficult. This next section is more difficult, and so let's have some grace going forward, and that is that co-addicts must join the journey. Let's talk about this term co-addict. Simply marrying someone who is struggling with addiction doesn't mean that you're a co-addict. A co-addict is basically just acknowledging that you yourself have some addiction within your own right. Now you might think, I'm not, again, as we talked about last week, I'm not an alcoholic, I'm not this, but you have some coping and survival strategies. And most importantly is that if you're in a relationship with someone who is dealing with severe addiction, you can believe the lie that all the work is on their shoulders. And what that does is that makes you a victim, because your life can't get better until they get their act right. And by basically admitting that you also have some addictive tendencies, you have some abuse in your life, and that's created some unhealthy categories. Part of you chose a person who is addicted, and so there's something in you, subconsciously or whatever, that led you to choose this partner. That makes you a co-addict in a way. Now, we're not throwing blame on you. It's just taking part of the journey. So putting some things on your own shoulders is really important. And you have your own wounds. You have your own addictions, your own abuses, your own things that you need to walk through. And it's also really important to look at, have you created, let's say you're in a relationship with someone who's having severe addiction issues. Has their acting out or their flaws or their failures created within you your own coping and survival strategies that are pushing you towards your own addictions? Again, and those addictions can be codependency, they can be religious addictions, they can be, food addictions, they can be all sorts of things. And so are you acting out against them and you really enjoy like berating them and condemning them? Is that something you've become addicted to? So co-addicts must join the journey. Otherwise, it's not going to be beneficial, because everyone has issues and you can't place everything on one person. That creates them to be a mini G God, because now they have control over your life. And although they're a terrible God and they're bringing you suffering, it places too much control in their hands. I cannot be happy until they solve their issues. And so that's part of what this is about, co-addicts joining the journey. Again, take some time to talk amongst yourselves. Does anyone have anything to say about this little section? Does this make anyone angry? Why? Why does it make you angry? And does anyone find this to be profound or life-altering? How or why? So take some time to talk amongst yourselves, and we'll come back for our next section here in just a moment. Hopefully, you guys have had a fantastic conversation about joining on the journey, or co-addicts joining on the journey. So, one thing we want to talk about is that just because we're using the term co-addict, it does not mean that you are responsible for the actions of someone who's addicted, and the person who's addicted is not responsible for those they're in a relationship that they're co-addicted. Everyone needs to take mutual responsibility, which brings us to our next section, which is titled Taking Mutual Responsibility. Everyone needs to take responsibility for their own actions. One example I read that I really liked, someone was encouraging, was saying that there's two lists that someone will write every day. One person in the couple will write things you did or that the other person did that were helpful or beneficial to the relationship. And the other list they keep is things that they did that were not helpful or beneficial to the relationship. So what they do is every day they'd take 15 minutes and they would just write out things that they believe they did wrong and things they believe the other person did right. And then they would swap the lists and ask for clarification, and then each person was seeing things that the other person took responsibility for. Again, if I punch you in the face, that's on me. I'm a bad person. I hit you in the face. It's shame on me. But if you turn around and grab a gun and shoot me, well, then you're guilty of murder for shooting me. And so it's just, and that's an extreme example just for kind of a little bit of levity. But the idea is that if someone who is addicted is acting out and doing something terrible, and so then you act out and do something terrible in response, it's neither are justified. You're just both blind, right? An eye for an eye leaves the world blind. And so what this is all about, it's about taking mutual responsibility for your actions in your relationship and taking responsibility for yourself. There is a power in acknowledging that the other person did not force you to do something, but you acted of your own power, of your own responsibility. What's also really important here is that if you're out there and you've been addicted and you have acted out in some maybe horrific ways or some terrible ways, it's important to take control yourself of your own actions. And so for the spouse or loved one of such a person, it's important to let them take control of their own actions. So to throw out questions like, should you be watching that, or should you be going there, or should you be drinking that, these kind of things actually take responsibility away from the addict, because what they're going to do is they're going to rely upon you to call them out. And so if you don't call them out, they're going to think there's nothing wrong with my behavior, or I'm getting away with it because either A, they don't know, or B, they're not calling me out on it. And so it's important to each take mutual responsibility of your actions and to allow each other to have their feelings. Now, that's not to say there's not a space to confront one another or to acknowledge a safe place for discussion. We will get into those things. We're still at the very beginning of this hard process, but take a moment as well to pause the video, talk amongst one another. And again, how does this section make you feel? Does it make you angry? Why? Is anything profound or life-altering? Take a moment, go around the group and have a quick discussion about this section. I think this can be really revealing for yourself to see where you're at with this process. Hopefully you guys have had a fantastic conversation about taking mutual responsibility. The next part is on the same line, and you might take a second to understand how it's actually quite different. And that is confronting your own abuse. So here's why this is important, and it's a little different than what we just talked about. Abused people tend to find each other. One, because I believe almost everyone is abused in life. Everyone has trauma. But they tend to pair up. And so someone who grew up with maybe some familial abuse will find someone else who has a very similar familial abuse, or might complete them in a certain way. One example is a man who was mistreated by his mother might seek a woman to mother him. Whether he knows it or not, he's looking for someone with motherly qualities that either A, his mother had, and then he was so abused he became hardened against them, or the mother was gone, and these are traits he's always wanted. So he marries a woman who perhaps has father issues or daddy issues, and she's seeking a man to gain that kind of emotional respect and trust from that maybe she didn't get from her father. Well, the man's looking for the wife to be a mother, and the mother's looking for the husband to be a father. And the truth is, nothing will really replace those relationships. A wife is not a replacement for a mom, and a husband is not a replacement for a dad. And so what'll happen is, as they seek for each other to complete each other's neglect and abuse, they won't fit correctly. The pieces won't work. And so the husband grows enraged at the wife because she's not exactly fulfilling his needs. It might seem like that at first, but once the infatuation stage wears off and the chemicals kind of calm down in the brain, he begins to see it's not exactly what he was looking for. The wife, in the same way, may have the same reaction, and they grow angry at each other. It's important to understand your own abuse, because you realize that although there might be acting out here and there, ultimately this is rooted in your own abuse. You are hoping to treat an abuse or trauma you had with the other person. And that's not that other person's fault for not meeting the criteria, because they never could. A husband will never replace your father. A wife will never replace your mom. It's similar relationships, but just completely different. And so that abuse needs to be confronted and mourned as it exists in reality. The reality is your dad wasn't there. The reality is your mom wasn't there. The reality is you were hurt. You were, abused. And that needs to be approached with honesty and sincerity for what it really is: a letdown, an abuse, a neglect, a hurt, a pain. And it's not the other person's fault, because they can't fulfill that need. So you take ownership of your abuse, you confront your own abuse, and that will help you understand that, sure, your spouse is not perfect, your significant other, your partner, they're not perfect, but they're not to blame for all the reasons that you're perhaps putting on them. And anytime that you take someone, you put them on a shelf that they don't belong, I believe it's a form of idolatry. Where you're not viewing them the way Christ views them. You're hoping that they can be more than they were ever intended to be. And I really think that's what idols are. Idols are when we take mundane things and we ask them to be more than mundane things, and in which case we devote worship to them. In many ways, you can worship a spouse, you can worship a boss, you can worship a job, you can worship many of your addictions. And so we don't want idolatry. So as per usual, take a moment to confront your own abuse. Talk about how does this section make you feel? What are, if anyone feels open to sharing, what are some things that you've maybe had in your life in ways that you realize now perhaps you're placing an unfair burden on a friend, a significant other, a spouse, a family member, and really it is just a result of your own abuse. In the same way, we're going to take this same typical conversation. Does anyone have anything to say about this section? Does it make you angry? Why? Does anyone find it profound or life-altering? How or why? So what does this look like for you? Take a moment to chat. We will be back for the next section in just a moment. Hopefully you guys have had a great conversation about confronting your own abuse and the many abuses in your lives. Hopefully this is, a thought-provoking exercise that can maybe be a little bit of an eye-opener for you. Next, we're going to have a little bit of a triggering word here, and that is strive towards intimacy. But it's important to note that I don't mean sex. When I say intimacy, I mean being intimate with someone, letting them in on your inner thoughts and emotions. So this is allowing someone to open up. Now, when trust is violated, and that's what happens with addicts and addiction in many ways, no matter whether it's pornography or alcohol or whatever the addiction might be, you hurt the other people around you because your addiction basically affects them. And so what's important is it can be difficult to then want to be intimate with a person who has harmed you or wronged you in that way, to let them into your inner thoughts, to let them into who you really are, how you act, how you feel. And so it can create disorders within people, a fear of abandonment. I can't actually open up. I can't actually let them know how I feel or what I'm struggling with because they'll leave me. And so when you strive towards intimacy, we're going to talk a lot in this series about shame and how shame is really the counterproductive enemy of this entire process. But when someone feels like they can't be intimate, they can't open up and tell you how they really feel, that they can't be vulnerable with you, it creates a sense of shame. And when there's shame involved, someone can't get healing. Shame kind of blocks healing. And where there is shame, where there is a lack of intimacy, it creates more acting out and more bad behaviors because a person, again, thinks that their needs are not getting met, it creates kind of a cycle. And so because the needs are not being met, they turn towards an addiction to meet that need in another way. And it's just bad all around. Now, we've talked about taking mutual responsibility. We've talked about how, everyone's responsible for their own actions, but striving towards intimacy is important, because if you refuse to be intimate with your partner, then you are guilty. That is something that if you're writing your list, as we talked about before, you'd have to put, what did I do that was not beneficial towards my relationship? I wasn't allowing intimate conversation, right? I wasn't open to intimacy. And so that is a negative boom. Now, if the other person acts out because of that, that's still on them. They should not have acted out. And so they'd have to write down, I acted out, and they can't blame you for it. But this is about partnership, working together. And so both own a piece of the pie. So strive towards intimacy. Take a moment to talk about this with one another. And as the same thing, did anyone find this thought-provoking? What ideas does this kind of generate among you? I find that these are important talking points to generate discussion. Hopefully tonight is a lot more of you guys talking and a lot less of me talking. Otherwise, this is a lot of awkward just kind of sitting here and be like, talk amongst yourselves. Silence, silence, silence. Okay, press play. What else does Bryce have to say to us? So please be talking to one another. Please open up. If someone's out there and people aren't really talking, take that leap of faith. Jump out there. Put yourself out there. And what you're going to find is that most other people in the room will begin to open up. Everyone's waiting on that one person to be the hero. Get that conversation going, and we'll be right back to talk a little bit more. Hopefully you guys have had a great conversation about striving towards intimacy, being open to one another. And that really does lead us into the next section, which is talking about past behaviors. Part of being intimate and open is allowing the person to know who you really are. And so there might be things in your past that you're not proud of. I remember that in my previous marriage, I was sexually abused as a small child. And in my previous marriage, I didn't ever want to bring that up to my wife, because I never wanted her to know or think of me in that way. I didn't want her to know who had sexually abused me, because I didn't want to make it awkward. I felt like I had healing over that, and I didn't want her to be weird around that person or perhaps try to defend me in some weird way. And so it was a whole thing. And so I never really brought that up. And it wasn't until we were married about 9 years that I finally brought up my own sexual abuse. And it's so interesting, because she herself was also a victim of sexual abuse. And for years, I had heard her talk about this, and I never wanted to open up that part of myself to her. And so that's something I got to write down. That was bad. That was a negative thing in my marriage, is that I wasn't intimate enough to let her know who I really was. And so because I wasn't, if you're out there and you're struggling with intimacy disorder, you're afraid that if you tell the other person who you really are, that they will leave you. Well, let me tell you from experience, that fear might be very well founded. They might leave you, but trust me, it's better to walk in freedom. It is better to face that now than farther in the future. And so hopefully, you've got someone who's here with you in this process. My ex-wife never would have been to any sort of group like this with me, so you're probably in a safe space anyways. But intimacy disorder, again, is fearing that if you let someone know who you really are, they won't accept you and they won't love you, and that you'll lose them. And you're really going to have to rip that Band-Aid. Now, I'm not saying sit down in one moment and just blurt out everything that you've ever done, every bad thing that's ever happened to you, every bad thing you've ever done, right? That could be a lot to put on someone. And I'm not necessarily saying dump that all on your spouse or your significant other or your family member in one go. But essentially, you want to work towards this process with, conversations here and there. And don't try to sugarcoat it. Don't try to there's a deceitful tactic that happens here that thinks, oh, maybe I can spin this in a little bit of a better light one way or another. Don't do that. Just take it head on and admit what has happened, admit what you've done. Let your partner or your spouse, deal with that. It's going to take some time for that to sink in. At first, they might be relieved that the truth is finally out. Then hurt might set in. That'll lead us to our next section, which is going to be about, in our last section for the night, which is going to be about having safe conversations about anger and resentment. That's going to be really needed if we're going to talk about past behaviors. But it is so worth it. Please hear me when I say this, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and those aspects are found in Jesus as the truth, you find the life and you find the way. So it's so important to just overcome that intimacy disorder. And intimate disorder is essentially, it's demolished, it's overcome when both people in a relationship both feel that they can be intimate with one another. They can let the other person know who they really are, and that's going to grow your marriages in such a far-reaching way. And if you're here with, a friend, a family member, that's going to grow your relationship with that person in such a far-reaching way when you can both be open and honest with everything you've done, who you are. There's no shame, there's no condemnation. Yes, there will be consequence. Yes, there will be hurt feelings, and we're going to take time to talk about that. But for now, why don't you guys talk about some risks that you can identify that might, just be open. Hey, I fear to bring up or talk about things because I don't want to fight. I'm afraid they're going to leave me. I'm afraid they're going to hate me. Even call out some of the other lies that you might be telling yourself. I want to spare them from the pain. I want to, right? There's all these kind of ideas you can have in your head. Oh, things will never be the same once I say this. The truth is, things will never be the same the moment you did it. You're just trying to hold off the fallout. So I'm not saying to do it here in this discussion now, but have a round table conversation. Go around the group and talk about ways that you guys can feel about this section. Again, does it make anyone angry? Why? Is this profound or life-altering? How and why? And again, just to recap, call out some lies, some things that would hold you back from being intimate, things that would hold you back from letting someone know who you really are. And trust me, Jesus knows who you really are. Jesus knows everything about you, and he loves you, and he died for you knowing that you would do those things and that you've been those things. And so embrace freedom in this section. Talk amongst yourselves, and we'll be back for our last little section here in a moment. Hopefully you guys have had a great conversation about talking about past behaviors, and hopefully some people have had the courage to open up some maybe lies they tell themselves about why they don't like to share, or some fears that they have that if I express these things, it'll turn around on me in a negative way. And they've gained a little bit of courage. Hopefully you've gained a little bit of courage to be more intimate with one another, talk about past behaviors, and open up and let your spouse, the most loved person you have in the world, know who you really are. Now we're going to talk about having safe conversations about anger and resentment. So as people open up in these conversations and tell you who they really are, you might be angry at some things that they've done and some things about who they really are. I think it's really important for couples to first identify destructive fighting strategies that they have. And so this can be profanity, name calling, hitting with physical violence, fighting late at night so the other person's on a bad, ground, fighting for long hours so to wear the other person down. These are destructive fighting strategies that we see sometimes in relationships. And again, this can be marriage, this can be family, this can be all, friendships, this can be all sorts of things. So if you're going to talk to someone about anger and resentment, you need to list out and call yourself out on things that you do. Now, this is not a time for the other person to say, oh, don't forget to add to the list this thing you do. That's just going to cause more anger and resentment. I could almost picture writing a comedy sketch about such an interaction. But write down these safe strategies, and then set aside a time to actually have it out, to have these safe conversations, and maybe even put a time limit on them so that there's a good time and space for them. If you've got kids, make sure the kids are, away from such conversations and times. Drop them off at a parent's house or a babysitter or whatever, and take some time to go out and do this. Let me tell you personal experience that stopped me from doing this in my marriage. One, I wanted a friend more than anything, so I never wanted to fight with my wife, and so I would never tell her when she hurt my feelings, hardly ever, because I didn't want to fight with her. I wanted to enjoy life with her, and so we were into a lot of the same things, and art and video games and all that fun stuff. And I was like, I want to spend my time in marriage doing that. I don't want to fight with her. And so for a lot of these reasons, I would not open up who I really was because I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to hurt her. I wouldn't have safe conversations about anger and resentment because I would just rather be her friend. And that was very destructive. It created an intimacy disorder where she never really got to know who I truly was in our marriage because I was always kind of hiding part of me from her because I just didn't want to fight her. And so that's not good. And so it's important to have actually have these conversations out, create this safe space, and have these conversations. Another thing was, setting aside time to have these safe conversations. It was like, man, we barely have time for a date anyways. It would be better just to go on a date. And so we did that. We would go on dates and have amazing, romantic, wonderful dates, with some great 50 Shades of Grey endings. But we never dealt with our issues. And so anytime we did get some time set aside, we would have a date instead of having an important conversation. And there needs to be balance there. Trust me, I get it. You've got kids, you've got work, you've got life. There's all this stuff going on. But it's so important that you set aside time to have these hard conversations. And that might mean you have to sacrifice a night that would be a date night. But just as a date night is so formative and healing for a relationship and necessary, these conversations are even more formative and necessary for a relationship. So make sure you're setting aside the time to do this. And so now let's talk about some homework. Okay, that's it for now. We're gonna pause the video here in a moment. You guys can talk about these conversations and kind of wrap up and eat whatever finger food's left around. Hopefully there's some food left for you guys. If not, I just called out the host. Get some food for people. Come on, they're hungry. But this week asked a lot of us, each of us personally. It probably requires personal time and much prayer to truly reflect the depth of all these things. Next week, we're moving from a focus on personal commitment to more of a focus on healing. And so that's going to be a funner conversation. So this is the hard week. Next week, we're going to talk about, we're opening up with playing with one another. And that means, playing games and enjoying one another. And, so it's going to be the homework for next week to prepare for that is have a game night with your spouse or loved one. Include your children if you've got them, if you wish, but then send them to bed, early or whatever, and then continue to play the game one-on-one. It's going to be really important for you guys to learn how to play. There's going to be some old wounds kind of picked at here, and it's going to be rough. So spend some time to enjoy one another. Have a date night, have a game night, laugh, tickle, kiss and hug, all that good stuff, because you're going to be on your guard because the enemy's going to come against your marriage. Those hard feelings are a step towards very serious healing and true love towards one another. And don't feel like you're alone. When you walk out here and some people are kind of quiet, don't feel like you're going to be on this journey alone. Like not every other couple in the room or all the other couples going through this study, around the world are not doing the same thing. You guys are all in this together, okay? You are not unique. There is, these are common problems. There's no need to be ashamed. People are going through this. I've been through it. And so, and remember with the game, don't get overly competitive. It's about having fun. All right, guys, thank you so much for being a part of this study. God bless you all, and enjoy your week and really lean into the work to be done. And I'm so excited to see you guys next week as we continue our conversation about partnering together for healing. But we focus more again on the process of healing, and it's going to be a little bit of a lighter conversation. All right, God bless you guys. Bye-bye.